In 1932, a desperate family fed 6 children for an entire year, using a garden the size of a modern parking space. While today we think we need acres of land and expensive equipment, they used broken barrels and aggressive planting methods to grow massive amounts of high-calorie food. These 30 forgotten survival secrets from the Great Depression show exactly how people beat starvation using just trash and dirt. Let us explore the ruthless efficiency of the survival garden and learn how to maximize every single inch of available earth. We begin with number 30, which revolutionized how people grew calorie-dense crops in extremely tight urban spaces. When families lost their large farms and moved to cramped city tenements, they realized traditional potato trenches required far too much horizontal room. Resourceful fathers began stacking discarded automobile tires and filling them with a mixture of scavenged dirt and dry autumn leaves. They planted one single seed potato at the bottom and kept stacking tires and adding dirt as the green plant reached higher toward the sun. By the end of the long summer, they had a massive rubber tower sitting in a totally useless rocky corner of the tiny yard. When autumn arrived, they simply kicked the tower over to harvest up to 40 pounds of perfect potatoes from just 3 square feet of space. The black rubber absorbed the intense summer heat deeply, which warmed the soil and caused the tubers to multiply rapidly underground. This brilliant vertical method completely bypassed the need for large empty fields and provided crucial winter carbohydrates for desperate hungry families. Number 29 involves adapting the ancient Native American Three Sisters method for incredibly small Depression-era backyard plots. Traditional farmers planted corn, beans, and squash together in massive, sprawling fields, but urban gardeners had to compress this highly productive ecosystem. They planted their corn stalks extremely close together in tight circular clusters rather than stretching them out in long, straight agricultural rows. Once the corn grew 1 foot tall, they aggressively planted climbing pole beans directly around the base of the sturdy green stalks. The aggressive beans climbed the corn stalks, saving precious horizontal space, while actively pulling free nitrogen down into the depleted urban soil. Around the outer edge of this tight cluster, they planted dense, sprawling squash vines that completely covered the bare dirt with massive green leaves. This thick, living mulch permanently trapped the morning dew and completely prevented any competitive weeds from stealing the incredibly precious soil nutrients. 3 different calorie-dense crops grew harmoniously in a tiny circular footprint, yielding massive amounts of survival food from practically nothing. Number 28 is the highly aggressive practice of successive planting, where absolutely no patch of dirt was ever left empty. Modern gardeners often harvest a spring crop and leave the ground completely bare until the following year. But survival gardeners could never afford that luxury. The exact moment an early spring cabbage was pulled from the earth, a young summer pepper plant was immediately shoved right into the exact same hole. This ruthless agricultural efficiency ensured that the tiny patch of dirt was actively producing human food every single day of the long growing season. They carefully organized their limited seeds so that fast-growing radishes were harvested just as the neighboring slow-growing tomatoes needed more room. The soil was never allowed to rest during the warm months because an empty patch of garden meant an empty plate on the dinner table. This intense, constant rotation heavily depleted the soil, but it completely maximized the total caloric output of the precious small backyard. They fed the exhausted dirt with kitchen scraps during the harsh winter, so it would be ready to work tirelessly again the following spring. Number 27 turns the actual physical structure of the family home into a highly productive vertical farming surface. Landlords often strictly forbade tenants from digging up the small front lawns, so families looked upward to the bare, sunny walls of their houses. They pounded rusty nails directly into the wooden siding and ran cheap cotton string all the way up to the high roof eaves. Heavy climbing crops like pole beans and sweet peas eagerly raced up these strings, turning the entire side of the house into a massive green wall. This vertical strategy not only produced an incredible amount of high-protein food, but it also actively shaded the house during the brutal summer heat. The dense wall of green leaves absorbed the harsh sunlight, keeping the stifling, unair-conditioned bedrooms significantly cooler for the exhausted sleeping children. When the autumn frost finally killed the vines, the dry brown stalks were carefully pulled down and used as valuable kindling for the kitchen stove. It was a brilliant dual-purpose survival trick that claimed completely unused vertical airspace and transformed it into a highly productive agricultural zone. Number 26 solved the massive problem of keeping heavily crowded plants properly watered during the terrible drought years of the 1930s. When you pack dozens of hungry plants into a tiny square of dirt, the fierce competition for limited water becomes incredibly deadly. Clever gardeners took cracked, discarded metal buckets and punched several small holes directly into the rusted bottoms using a heavy steel nail. They buried these broken buckets deeply in the center of their tightly packed garden beds, leaving only the very top rim exposed above the dirt. Instead of watering the surface where the hot sun would quickly evaporate the moisture, they poured their precious water directly into the sunken bucket. The water slowly seeped out through the deep holes, delivering life-saving hydration directly to the absolute bottom of the thirsty plant roots. This deep watering method forced the roots to grow significantly further down into the earth, making the plants incredibly resilient against the scorching surface heat. It turned useless, broken trash into a highly efficient underground irrigation system that saved millions of vegetables from dying in the severe drought. Number 25 completely eliminated the need for a dedicated compost pile, which normally wastes valuable horizontal gardening space. Building a traditional compost bin requires a large empty area and months of patient waiting, which starving families simply did not have. Instead, they practiced aggressive trench composting by digging a very deep, narrow ditch directly between their active rows of growing vegetables. Every single night, the meager potato peels, apple cores, and bitter coffee grounds were dumped directly into this open trench and covered with fresh dirt. The local earthworms immediately migrated to this massive underground food source and digested the raw garbage directly next to the spreading plant roots. As the worms traveled back and forth, they actively aerated the dense soil and deposited highly concentrated nutrients exactly where the plants needed them most. By the time the next spring arrived, the old trench became the new planting row, and a new trench was dug where the old plants stood. This constant shifting rotation built incredibly deep, fertile topsoil without ever sacrificing a single square inch of productive above-ground growing space. Number 24 is a brilliant intercropping technique that exploits the different growing speeds of common, everyday root vegetables. Carrots take incredibly long to germinate and grow, leaving the surrounding soil completely bare and highly vulnerable to fast-growing aggressive weeds. Depression-era gardeners solved this by mixing tiny radish seeds directly into the exact same planting furrow as their slow-growing carrot seeds. The radishes sprouted almost immediately, breaking up the hard surface crust of the dirt and marking the exact location of the invisible row. As the radishes grew, their broad green leaves heavily shaded the bare soil, keeping the dirt perfectly moist for the struggling tiny carrot seedlings. In exactly 30 days, the plump radishes were completely harvested and pulled out of the earth, yielding a fast, peppery food source for the family. Pulling the radishes naturally loosened the deep soil around the remaining carrots, giving their orange roots the perfect amount of space to grow massive. Two completely different crops were successfully harvested from the exact same single row, proving that timing is just as important as physical space. Number 23 highlights the absolute dominance of dry climbing beans as the ultimate survival food of the entire Depression era. While juicy red tomatoes and crisp cucumbers tasted wonderful, they contained mostly water and offered very few actual sustaining human calories. Dry beans like pintos and navies were incredibly dense with heavy protein and complex carbohydrates that could keep a working man standing on his feet. Gardeners planted these aggressive vines everywhere, allowing them to completely overtake old wooden fences, broken gates, and even dead barren trees. Unlike delicate summer vegetables, these tough bean pods were simply left on the vine until they became totally dry and rattled loudly in the autumn wind. They required absolutely no expensive glass jars or complicated hot water canning equipment to preserve for the long, brutal winter months. A family could simply shell the dry beans into a large cotton sack and store them safely in a dark, dry closet for several entire years. A tiny patch of vertical climbing beans provided significantly more winter survival calories than a massive, sprawling field of delicate summer salad greens. Number 22 involves the highly controversial but historically accurate use of human waste products to aggressively fertilize depleted backyard soil. Chemical fertilizers were completely out of reach for unemployed factory workers, so they had to look inward to find crucial nitrogen for their hungry plants. The men of the house would urinate into a dedicated metal bucket, which was then heavily diluted with 10 parts of plain drawn well water. This highly diluted liquid gold was carefully poured around the base of nitrogen-loving plants like heavy cabbage and massive, towering cornstalks. While modern sensibilities might find this practice entirely repulsive, human urine is actually completely sterile and absolutely packed with incredibly pure plant-available nitrogen. Combined with the heavy potassium found in the cold ashes from their winter wood stoves, they created a perfectly balanced, complete agricultural fertilizer. This closed-loop biological system ensured that absolutely zero valuable nutrients ever left the strict boundaries of the struggling family property. It was a quiet, unspoken survival tactic that transformed literal human waste into towering green plants and ultimately into fresh, sustaining food. Number 21 focuses on scavenging urban destruction to build highly effective season-extending cold frames for early spring planting. A cold frame acts exactly like a miniature greenhouse, capturing the weak spring sun and protecting tiny, fragile seedlings from deadly, freezing night winds. Destitute gardeners actively roamed city alleys and abandoned construction sites, specifically looking for discarded wooden window sashes with intact glass panes. They built low, slanted wooden boxes facing the direct southern sun and placed these scavenged glass windows securely on top on the iron hinges. Inside these incredibly warm, protected wooden boxes, they could easily start cabbages and heavy greens a full 6 weeks before the last terrible spring frost. This massive head start meant they were harvesting fresh, nutritious food while their wealthy neighbors were still waiting for the frozen ground to thaw. During the absolute hottest summer months, the glass covers were completely removed, and the wooden frames were aggressively planted with heat-loving bush beans. The discarded trash of the broken city became the exact mechanism that allowed the poor man to completely conquer the incredibly short natural growing season. Here is a critical pattern break regarding everything we have discussed about the survival garden so far in this historical journey. The Great Depression completely destroyed the luxurious idea of gardening as a relaxing weekend hobby for wealthy suburban homeowners looking for pleasant aesthetics. Every single technique we have covered was born from the absolute terrifying desperation of hearing innocent children crying from deep stomach hunger. You must deeply understand that an empty patch of dirt was not just an eyesore, it was considered a tragic waste of potential human life. Number 20 blurs the strict line between a formal planted vegetable garden and the aggressive foraging of wild native edible weeds. During the absolute worst years of the economic crash, people simply could not afford to buy enough commercial seeds to fill their entire garden plot. Instead of weeding their gardens entirely bare, they learned to carefully identify and aggressively cultivate highly nutritious wild plants like dandelion and stinging nettle. They allowed these tough wild greens to grow thickly along the borders of their formal beds and harvested them exactly like planted spinach. Dandelions provided incredibly early spring nectar for crucial pollinating bees, and their deep taproots pulled heavy hidden minerals up to the topsoil surface. The bitter green leaves were absolutely packed with iron and vitamins, offering critical fresh nutrition long before the planted garden vegetables were completely ready. By intentionally managing these wild native weeds, the desperate gardener effectively doubled their total crop yield without spending a single penny on expensive seed packets. They stopped fighting nature and started eating the aggressive, resilient plants that naturally wanted to grow in their specific local soil. Number 19 elevated the simple act of saving autumn seeds into a highly rigid science of absolute complete genetic perfection. Today, gardeners save seeds casually, but Depression-era growers acted like ruthless agricultural judges, completely ignoring any plant that showed even slight weakness. If a tomato plant produced 50 fruits but wilted slightly during a summer drought, its seeds were completely banned from ever entering the storage envelope. They absolutely only saved seeds from the single strongest, fastest-growing, most disease-resistant champion plant in the entire backyard plot. This intense, aggressive selection process meant that over several difficult years their personal seed stock became completely genetically adapted to their exact backyard conditions. The plants grew incredibly tough and wildly productive because every single generation was strictly bred for maximum survival in that specific poor soil. They traded these elite seeds with their immediate neighbors, creating hyper-localized plant varieties that could easily completely outperform anything bought from a commercial catalog. Preserving the absolute best genetics was the ultimate insurance policy against the terrifying absolute uncertainty of the following warm spring season. Number 18 is the incredibly clever creation of hanging vertical root cellars using nothing but rough discarded burlap farm feed sacks. Urban gardeners with no bare ground left simply filled heavy burlap sacks with a rich mixture of scavenged street dirt and heavy horse manure. They hung these heavy dirt-filled bags from sturdy wooden tree branches, sturdy porch beams, and rusty iron clothesline poles all across the tiny yard. Carefully slicing small holes in the rough fabric, they pushed sprouted seed potatoes directly into the sides of the massive hanging bags. The potatoes grew aggressively outward through the tiny holes, creating a bizarre-looking floating bush that produced incredibly clean, disease-free underground tubers. Harvesting was incredibly simple because they only had to untie the heavy bag and dump the loose soil directly onto a clean wooden tarp. There was absolutely no back-breaking digging required, and the precious harvest was kept completely safe from hungry underground moles and destructive root maggots. Hanging burlap gardens effectively created completely new floating real estate in backyards where every single inch of actual ground was already taken. Number 17 utilizes the aggressive strategy of heavily planting fast-growing leafy greens directly under towering, tall, shade-producing vegetable crops. In the absolute brutal heat of late July, delicate crops like crisp lettuce and tender spinach normally turn incredibly bitter and die entirely. Survival gardeners prevented this tragedy by planting these delicate, cool-weather greens directly underneath the massive, sprawling leaves of towering giant squash and heavy corn. The tall crops acted exactly like a giant living umbrella, casting deep, cool shadows that significantly lowered the soil temperature below. This brilliant living shade allowed the family to actively harvest sweet, tender lettuce straight through the absolute hottest days of the brutal summer heatwave. The dense, low-growing greens also acted as a thick, living mulch that aggressively protected the thirsty corn roots from the harsh, baking sun. Two entirely different crops occupying the exact same vertical airspace, working in perfect harmony to completely maximize the caloric output of the tiny space. It was a beautiful working example of stacking agricultural functions to completely cheat the harsh natural limitations of the changing summer seasons. Number 16 focuses on the incredible caloric powerhouse of the sweet potato and the bizarre method used to grow them in deep wooden barrels. Sweet potatoes absolutely require loose, sandy soil to grow massive, heavy tubers, but city backyards mostly contained dense, compacted, heavy clay dirt. Resourceful gardeners scavenged large wooden whiskey barrels, drilled massive drainage holes in the bottom, and filled them entirely with a mix of dirt and river sand. They planted a single sweet potato slip in the top, and let the incredibly aggressive green vines spill wildly over the rough wooden sides. The dark, heavy wood of the barrel absorbed the bright sun, heating the enclosed sandy soil to the exact tropical temperatures the sweet potatoes absolutely craved. Because the dirt was incredibly loose and totally uncompacted, the underground tubers faced absolutely zero physical resistance and grew to absolutely massive, gigantic proportions. A single wooden barrel sitting on a solid concrete patio could easily produce 50 pounds of heavy, dense, orange carbohydrates by late autumn. When winter came, the family moved the heavy barrel into the dark basement, using the dry sand itself as the perfect long-term preservation storage. Number 15 actively reclaimed the completely wasted dead space, located directly underneath the heavy sweeping branches of mature backyard fruit trees. Modern aesthetic landscaping usually dictates keeping a perfectly neat, clean circle of bare dirt or plain green grass directly under a heavy apple tree. The survival gardener saw this empty, shaded dirt as a totally unacceptable waste of incredibly valuable horizontal backyard residential real estate. They aggressively planted shallow-rooted, shade-tolerant crops like garlic, wild onions, and heavy, dense radishes directly right up against the rough wooden tree trunk. The strong, pungent odors of the garlic and wild onions actively confused flying insect pests, completely protecting the ripening sweet fruit hanging high above. Because these specific root crops barely scratched the absolute surface of the dirt, they never aggressively competed with the incredibly deep, heavy tree roots. This clever planting strategy maximized the ground space while simultaneously providing an invisible organic chemical defense shield for the highly valuable autumn fruit harvest. Nothing was ever allowed to remain empty, and every single plant was forced to aggressively pull its own weight in the crowded backyard ecosystem. Number 14 details the absolute foulest smelling, but most incredibly effective organic pesticide ever created in a poor man's kitchen. Chemical bug sprays were totally unaffordable and highly toxic, so gardeners relied on intense, aggressive biological warfare to protect their precious, fragile food. They completely crushed entire heads of strong garlic, fiery hot peppers, and bitter wild onion grass into a large, rusty tin metal bucket. They poured boiling hot water heavily over this pungent mixture and let it steep violently in the blazing sun for 3 entire days. The resulting dark, cloudy liquid smelled absolutely horrific and was incredibly caustic to the highly sensitive soft bodies of destructive garden caterpillars and heavy beetles. They used a bundle of dry straw to heavily flick this spicy, toxic tea directly onto the delicate leaves of their highly vulnerable cabbage plants. Any insect that attempted to take a single bite of the treated leaf was instantly repelled by the intense burning heat of the hot pepper oils. This homemade defensive spray cost absolutely nothing but provided an impenetrable chemical fortress against the endless swarms of hungry summer agricultural pests. Number 13 is the incredibly tedious but absolutely mandatory practice of aggressive hand pollination to completely guarantee a massive, heavy autumn yield. During the Dust Bowl years, heavy blowing dirt and massive habitat destruction severely reduced the natural populations of vital flying bumblebees. Rather than trusting totally fickle nature, the desperate gardener would walk their crowded rows every single morning armed with a tiny, soft rabbit hair paintbrush. They meticulously gathered heavy yellow pollen from the male squash flowers and aggressively painted it directly deep onto the center of the receptive female flowers. This incredibly slow, deliberate process absolutely guaranteed that every single female flower would successfully swell into a massive, heavy, calorie-dense winter squash. When human starvation is the absolute terrifying alternative, you simply cannot afford to let a single tiny flower die completely unpollinated and totally wasted. They became the active, busy bees of their own tiny ecosystems, ensuring that every single drop of plant energy was forcefully converted into edible human food. It was highly repetitive, exhausting morning labor that totally paid off in massive mountains of heavy winter food stored safely in the dark cellar. Number 12 sounds like complete folk magic, but it was actually a highly effective method for curing severe hidden nutrient deficiencies in heavy, poor soil. When tomato plants suddenly turned pale yellow with dark green veins, the older generation instantly recognized the classic, terrifying signs of severe iron chlorosis. Without any money for expensive commercial mineral supplements, they sent their children to aggressively scavenge the dirty city streets for heavy, rusty iron nails. They took these incredibly rusty pieces of discarded metal and buried them deeply into the wet soil at the base of the dying plant. The natural biological acids present in the living soil heavily reacted with the deep rust, slowly releasing pure, usable iron directly to the struggling plant roots. Within a single week, the pale, dying leaves completely miraculously turned a vibrant, deep, healthy, dark green, and the plant absolutely aggressively resumed its upward growth. It was a perfect, brilliant example of using useless, dangerous street garbage to completely heal a sick, struggling biological organism without spending a single copper penny. The absolute poorest people often possess the absolute deepest practical understanding of basic agricultural chemistry, simply out of raw, terrifying necessity. Number 11 transformed the simple legal concept of a property boundary line into a massive, highly productive wall of thick, dense human food. Instead of building expensive, sterile wooden fences to separate their tiny yards from their neighbors, they actively planted massive, incredibly dense, living, edible hedges. They heavily seeded towering, tall, massive sunflowers mixed with aggressive climbing beans and thorny, wild blackberry bushes directly along the entire exact property line. This incredibly thick, tangled green wall completely blocked the view of the crowded, noisy city alleyway, while simultaneously producing hundreds of pounds of food. The thick, heavy sunflower stalks acted as massive wooden pillars. The beans provided heavy climbing stability, and the sharp blackberry thorns provided intense physical security. Roaming stray dogs and hungry neighborhood thieves absolutely could not physically penetrate this incredibly dense, aggressive wall of sharp thorns and thick, heavy vines. It completely redefined the entire concept of defensive landscaping, proving that a security fence could easily also function as a massive neighborhood grocery store. This living barrier heavily trapped the warm sun, blocked the cold winter wind, and fed the struggling family entirely from the extreme outer edges of their land. Here is a second critical pattern break to examine: the absolute psychological reality of growing human food during the Great Economic Depression. These people were not actively trying to grow incredibly massive giant pumpkins to eagerly win a blue ribbon at the local summer county fair. They were aggressively fighting a literal daily war against severe malnutrition, scurvy, and the incredibly terrifying reality of a totally empty winter pantry. Every single rusty bucket, dirty seed, and broken glass window was a totally crucial loaded weapon in their desperate fight for daily physical survival. Number 10 is the absolute masterclass in heavily preserving precious summer water using massive amounts of discarded black and white daily newspaper. Water was heavily metered and completely expensive in the crowded urban cities, so deep, heavy, aggressive mulching was absolutely mandatory for basic garden survival. Every single Sunday, the heavy newspaper was heavily soaked in a large bucket of dirty kitchen water until it became a dense, heavy, grey mush. They laid these completely wet paper slabs thickly on the bare dirt, heavily overlapping the rough edges completely, entirely around the base of every single vegetable plant. As the hot, brutal sun baked the newspaper, it dried into an incredibly dense, solid paper crust that completely permanently sealed the soil moisture deep underground. Absolutely no aggressive weed seeds could ever penetrate this dark, heavy, thick paper barrier, meaning the exhausted gardener never had to weed the rows again. The earthworms absolutely loved the dark, cool, damp environment, completely underneath the paper, and heavily ate the rotting cellulose, completely enriching the soil below. At the very end of the year, the crumbling paper was simply heavily tilled right back into the earth, entirely disappearing forever into the dark dirt. Number 9 completely shifts the total absolute focus from delicate summer salad greens to the incredibly ugly but massive, heavy purple turnip. The humble purple top turnip was the absolute undisputed king of the survival garden because it actively, aggressively produced two completely different edible crops. Within 30 short days, the bright green leafy tops could be completely chopped off and heavily boiled exactly like dark, nutritious winter spinach. The thick, heavy plant would completely aggressively regrow these green leaves multiple times, providing an endless, steady supply of vital, fresh vitamin C. Below the dark dirt, the absolutely massive, heavy purple root was swelling to the exact size of a large, heavy wooden softball. These dense, starchy roots completely survived deep, heavy, hard winter freezes and could be aggressively left in the frozen dirt until heavily needed for winter stew. A single, tiny row of heavy purple turnips heavily provided significantly more total edible biomass than 4 massive rows of delicate green summer lettuce. The Depression-era gardener completely ignored pretty delicate vegetables and aggressively focused entirely on heavy, ugly plants that absolutely refused to die easily. Number 8 involves the incredibly heavy, grueling physical labor of building massively productive raised planting beds entirely from broken urban concrete and red bricks. City dirt is often heavily toxic, completely compacted, and absolutely full of dangerous broken glass and sharp, rusty metal scraps from old buildings. Desperate fathers spent absolutely exhausting weekends aggressively scavenging heavy, broken concrete chunks from completely abandoned construction sites and totally destroyed, ruined city lots. They heavily stacked these totally broken, heavy slabs exactly into neat, tall, square retaining walls directly over the totally ruined, compacted, barren urban topsoil. They heavily filled these sturdy stone boxes with pure, clean dirt scavenged from the deep local woods and thick, rich horse manure from the streets. The massive, heavy concrete blocks heavily absorbed the daytime summer sun and completely radiated that warm heat heavily into the dirt throughout the freezing cold night. This meant the completely raised soil warmed up significantly faster in the spring, heavily aggressively extending the totally incredibly short urban growing season. They effectively built highly productive, tiny, clean, pristine agricultural islands directly on top of totally, completely ruined, poisoned, destroyed city ground. Number 7 is the highly aggressive, relentless practice of actively foraging free, massive piles of heavy, raw animal manure from the city streets. In the 1930s, many heavy delivery wagons and large milk carts were still completely pulled by massive, strong agricultural draft horses. The observant, aggressive gardener always kept a large metal bucket and a wide, flat shovel waiting exactly on their open front porch. Whenever a delivery horse naturally relieved itself in the busy street, the gardener sprinted outside to aggressively, heavily claim the steaming prize. This free, heavy, rich manure was carefully mixed into the backyard soil, providing a massive, incredible surge of pure, natural, heavy nitrogen. It completely replaced the unaffordable, expensive commercial synthetic fertilizers that wealthy commercial farmers regularly used on their sprawling rural land. The absolute, desperate, complete, intense hunger of the family entirely overrode any delicate, squeamish feelings about scooping hot, raw street manure. The poorest, struggling families actively built the absolute thickest, richest, darkest, most incredibly productive fertile soil in the entire local neighborhood. Number 6 is the brutal, practical integration of wild meat trapping directly into the thick summer vegetable garden among the growing food. The massive, lush, green growth of the heavily packed survival garden naturally attracted incredibly hungry, roaming wild neighborhood rabbits and groundhogs. Instead of trying to keep these destructive pests out, the desperate gardener actively invited them inside the fenced perimeter area. They intentionally left a small open gap in the heavy wooden fence, directly leading exactly to a hidden metal wire snare. The incredibly hungry wild rabbit followed the sweet smell of the fresh green cabbage directly into the tight, hidden wire trap. In a single brief moment, the massive, destructive garden pest was instantly transformed into fresh, healthy, heavy dinner meat for the starving family. The carefully cleaned rabbit bones and raw offal were deeply buried back into the garden dirt to provide essential calcium for the vegetables. It was a totally closed survival loop, where absolutely nothing was ever wasted or thrown away carelessly by the resourceful, hungry family. Number 5 is the brilliant, careful manipulation of heavy microclimates directly along the southern-facing exterior house wall to extend the season. The solid, heavy, thick brick or wood of the southern wall aggressively absorbed maximum raw solar heat all throughout the sunny afternoon. Desperate, broke survival gardeners actively planted their most incredibly tender, sensitive crops tightly against this warm, defensive, structural building barrier. The massive, thick wall slowly radiated this captured deep heat back out into the cold night air until the early morning dawn. This incredibly brilliant localized warming effect easily stopped early devastating killing cold night frosts entirely in their freezing icy tracks. Heavy heat-loving crops like massive beefsteak tomatoes thrived in this deeply protected, tiny, warm microclimate space beside the brick walls. They effectively moved the local climate zone significantly further south by merely shifting a single row of green plants against the house. It proved that careful, aggressive placement was vastly more important than having massive, huge, wide-open, unprotected agricultural farming fields. Number 4 is the incredibly brutal, ruthless, aggressive culling of any totally weak, entirely struggling, fragile green plants in the vegetable row. Modern, delicate gardeners try to save every single sickly, yellow, struggling, tiny little seedling that looks vaguely unwell or slightly damaged. The hungry, broke, desperate depression gardener saw a sick plant as a massive, dangerous threat to the entire whole summer crop. A weak, struggling plant aggressively drank precious, rare water and stole vital, deep, rich nutrients from the significantly healthier neighboring vegetables. They ruthlessly, forcefully ripped these weak, failing green plants directly right out of the dark, wet garden dirt without any hesitation whatsoever. That exact, specific spot was immediately heavily, aggressively replanted with a significantly faster-growing, hearty, cold-weather resilient seed variety. You simply could not afford to subsidize a lazy, failing crop when your absolute survival depended on massive, predictable, heavy food yields. The complete survival garden was an incredibly highly competitive biological arena where only the absolute strongest plants remained alive to bear fruit. Number 3 is the bizarre but entirely brilliant aggressive planting of heavy, raw underground peanuts in terrible, sandy, depleted urban soil. When completely broke, struggling families lived on terrible, heavily sandy, poor dirt. They heavily planted incredibly tough, resilient peanut crops. Peanuts absolutely, deeply, naturally thrive in completely terrible, loose, dry sand, where absolutely nothing else will ever successfully manage to survive. They actively, incredibly, entirely pull their exact necessary rich nitrogen exactly right down directly heavily from the open atmosphere around them. Below the dry, hot, terrible surface, they produce massive, huge clusters of heavy, fat, rich, densely packed, nutritious survival nuts. These dense, thick nuts are absolutely heavily packed with massive, heavy, rich fat and vital, complex survival carbohydrates for the cold winter. A full, heavy mason jar of roasted peanuts could entirely, absolutely save a starving child during the deep, freezing winter months. The poor sandy dirt was entirely, completely transformed into highly calorie-dense human food using extreme biological ingenuity and natural plant chemistry. Number 2 is the incredibly clever creation of individual miniature greenhouses using nothing but scavenged clear glass jars from the local trash. Before industrial plastic was invented, desperate gardeners roamed the dirty alleys collecting heavy clear glass jars from local neighborhood trash bins. They placed these heavy glass domes directly over tiny green seedlings early in the freezing cold, damp spring mornings to save them. The clear glass trapped the weak sunlight and created a humid, warm microclimate that heavily protected the fragile growing new plant. This simple, transparent barrier completely blocked the freezing wind and stopped heavy frost from destroying the delicate new green, delicate leaves. It allowed the survival gardener to plant their crucial seeds a full 4 weeks before the last expected historical spring frost date. By the time their wealthy neighbors were just starting to dig their gardens, these protected plants were already huge and flowering vigorously. They effectively created a tiny custom climate for every single plant in the yard, using entirely free, discarded, common household garbage. Number 1 is not a physical tool, but the absolute most important psychological secret of the entire Depression-era backyard survival garden. Modern gardeners plan their backyards based on visual beauty, planting neat rows of colorful, delicate vegetables that look absolutely wonderful. The survival gardener planned their tiny plot entirely around maximum caloric density per square inch of available dark, black, rich dirt. They actively, completely ignored beautiful, fragile plants and grew ugly, heavy, dense starches that could safely survive the freezing cold winter. Every single agricultural decision was based on how many solid days a specific crop could physically keep a hungry family alive. Potatoes, dry beans, heavy turnips and massive winter squash were the absolute undisputed royalty of this completely ruthless growing system. Visual aesthetics meant absolutely nothing when the true ultimate goal was surviving a brutal freezing winter without any reliable money source. This radical shift from gardening for pleasure to gardening for pure, raw survival is exactly what kept the hungry working class alive. I strongly challenge you to try just one of these 30 forgotten methods in your own backyard this exact upcoming year. Build a towering potato tire stack or aggressively mulch your thirsty tomatoes with heavy, wet layers of discarded daily newspaper. These incredibly old practices were not just about saving pennies. They were about a profound respect for the living, productive soil. Tell me down in the comments below exactly which of these 1930s survival hacks you will absolutely resurrect this summer.